on this computer. Great. Okay, so I think that's all the text here and ready. If anyone can't hear us or see us for whatever reason, just let us know in the comments. This is the third day of the summit, and I'm really excited to be introducing Deborah. She is an amazing cybersecurity specialist who is talking a bit about what we can do to protect our data security and prepare for this new norm of working from home and all the technical changes that are occurring at the moment. So it's very timely and much needed. But before we dive into that, I'd just like to do a little bit of housekeeping just for anyone who's currently in the room that this might be relevant to. So as part of the whole process, I have included a trauma therapist to be on hand in case any of the subject matter we discuss may be triggering or difficult to hear or bring up some memories that you may be struggling with. So please know that you're not alone, and we do have that support here. So just let us know if you do need that assistance, and she'll be able to give you a 15-minute debrief. And on top of that, we've also included the hotlines for any emergency mental health services on the perks side of the website. So in case you have, in case you need that, that's there for you as well. And other than that, we are also offering a 10-minute Q&A at the end. So please feel free to submit your questions as we're going. I know sometimes it can be hard to remember them and save them. So just if we're talking and it brings up an idea for you, just pop into the chat box, and then I'll be able to read through it and get to that in the last 10 minutes. And of course, for every submission and every Q&A that you enter in, you go into the run to win some prizes. So there's a handful of books to be given out on personal development and culture. And then there's also a one-on-one session with me. So that's also a nice little bonus. And if you invite a friend, or if you found this helpful and you want to share it with someone else, you can always link them, and you'll also be bumped up as a higher chance of winning the prizes. So I think that's everything. And because Deborah has such an impressive history, tech is something that I know a little bit about, but nowhere near to the extent that I'm sure you do, Deb. So I'm just going to read your bio and let everyone know a bit more about you, and then we can get started. So Deborah has worked with technology startup companies for over 20 years. Her expertise is strategic marketing and sales. She has worked as a consultant, as an employee, and now as part of the founding team at ioFABRIC. And that is a data security company focusing on security backup files from ransomware and other malicious intent. Deborah's technology experience has given her a deep insight into internet security practices. And what better time than now to be getting this sort of insight. So thank you very much, Deborah, for joining us, and I look forward to hearing more from you. So with that said,
I'm looking forward to this.
Yes. With that said, I always like to just open up with a little bit of a conversation about your background. I think many of us have experienced toxic workplace culture, and that's kind of what inspired this whole thing. But moving forward, I think there is an opportunity to change toxic workplace culture and end that as the normalization and create a more progressive, positive work environment. So I'd love to know if you've experienced this kind of toxic workplace culture and what your history, career-wise, has been.
I don't know that I've experienced the toxic culture in the way that perhaps some of your attendees have, but I definitely work in a male-dominated environment where I'm always the minority. So there's very few women in tech, and rarely do I go into a meeting where there's another woman, at least at the senior level. So that can be intimidating. What I've done is I just know that knowledge is power, and I try to inform myself the best I can on whatever the topic is that we're dealing with, and I'm not afraid to speak up. And I think that's the best that you can do in an environment like that.
It's really great to hear that, you know, despite being a minority in the group, you still keep that confidence and own your place. I think that's hard to find, and it is a shame that, you know, you've been given that the ownership to kind of be the single female voice, but at the same time we always really appreciate the fact that at least there's someone in there doing that, so thank you. So along with that, I would love to know what, I mean, especially in regards to data security and privacy, I would love to know sort of a little bit more about what you do currently. What is ransomware? What should we be considering in a time like this? Please let us know a bit more about that.
Sure. Sure. I'll just explain what ransomware is, and it's very pertinent right now because, unfortunately, with all of us working from home and the tech teams not in the offices, we're actually all way more vulnerable, and our data is potentially out there to be stolen. So what ransomware is it's a software that's injected into a company's infrastructure. It usually, 90% of the time, comes in with what's called a phishing email. So I'm sure we've all received these emails in the past. They might pretend that they are, like in Canada, they'll pretend they're CRA, which is our revenue agency. They could spoof that they're your boss. They could say you've won a trip or something like that. And what they're asking you to do is to click a link. And if you click that link, it will download a program and it will launch into your infrastructure without you knowing. And they're very savvy about this, so it's not obvious that it's happening. And then usually the criminals will lurk on your system for a couple days, maybe a couple weeks. And what they're doing is they're observing what's happening on the network. So they'll learn when you do your backups. And I don't necessarily mean you, I mean like your IT staff. So when backups happen and where data is stored and how the servers are connected, and they can fuss all this out from being on your network. And then at a given day, they decide to launch the ransomware attack. And it usually happens on off hours or on a weekend or when staff aren't around. Now, today, because of what's happening with the pandemic, it could be any day. And then their software that they launch into the system will go first and encrypt backups or delete your backups. And then it will go to the primary data and do the same, encrypt or delete. And then a ransom is issued. So an email is sent or some type of communication, and they'll say, we want, $50,000 in Bitcoins, and it has to be delivered here, or we will not return your data. All you have to do is Google ransomware. There are so many examples of where it's happening. It's shut down cities, it's shut down hospitals, unfortunately. In Canada here, it actually shut down a huge laboratory that deals with blood tests and so forth. And they actually stole data in that particular case. So the problem is that they're shutting companies down, but another layer to it is that they're actually taking the data and then they can use that to exploit people.
And it's really scary because at the moment we're all sort of facing this like a loss of our freedom, and like it's even considered to be kind of like a grieving process in the sense that we're just getting used to this new idea that we can't necessarily do the things that we've always known we could do. And so to add this layer of like loss of privacy on top of that, it's just absolutely terrifying. So I really appreciate you shedding light on this as well. So along with that, I think that like there's a lot of it seems like what you're saying generally tends to impact companies more because they have a lot more important data that really would cost them everything to lose. Whereas maybe with the individuals, we don't want to lose our data, but at the end of the day, it's not necessarily worth, $25,000 or whatever the amount sums that these people would be asking for. So with that, I think there's been a lot of talk about, how everything's moving to cloud and there's a lot of migrations and how it's all kind of automated on this, magical, streamlined like area. What is your take on that in regards to safety and security? I mean, if it's all in kind of one cloud, and you don't know where that is or how that information is being stored, how does that play into our level of data security?
Right. Okay. So definitely I'll talk about the cloud. But before I get to that, can I just talk about some steps that people can take personally
yes,
to
please. Much needed.
make your data more secure? Okay, good. So there are a lot of things that an employee or a person can do, and then there's a bunch of things that an employer should be doing. But as an employee, you can bring this conversation up to your employer and hold them responsible for it. But let me first talk about what you can do personally. And some of these things are really easy. You don't have to be a tech expert for this. So the first thing I think everyone needs to do is to have a personal email address, separate from your work email address, because you want to separate your personal emails from your work emails for a lot of personal safety reasons. And I would recommend that you use one of the well-known email service providers. So that would be Gmail, iCloud, or Outlook. And the reason for that is because those companies, so Google, Microsoft, and Apple, they have the resources and the money to dedicate full-time security staff to protecting their platforms. And I know some people don't like these big companies, but the truth of the matter is they've set up their infrastructure to protect us. And that's your best bet. So for your personal email, get one of those email addresses. And there's two different ways you can go about this. With personal emails, you can either read them on a remote server, meaning like if you have a Gmail address, read them on Gmail and don't even bring those emails onto your work machine, whether it's a laptop or a desktop. So that's one example. If for whatever reason, maybe you've already started reading personal emails on a work machine, keep it in a separate folder. Because if you're ever leaving the organization, it's easiest to delete that information if it's all in one folder. You can do that manually, which is a pain, or you can set up your email system, whatever you're using, whether it's Outlook or whatever, or Gmail. You can set it up to filter everything that comes into that email address into a folder. And then it's also easy to keep track of personal and work. So you don't, you're not getting emails from your partner or your spouse at the same time from your boss.
That's so handy.
Sort of separating church and state, if you will.
Yeah.
So that's two things, really. So get a personal email address and then make sure you store it separately, either reading it on a remote server in the cloud or keeping it in a separate folder. And then you can do the same for documents. So if you're working on some personal files, which we all do, right? Like, and you're using, for example, Microsoft Office, you can store those on Dropbox or a similar service. And then they're not stored on your company's servers or their hardware. So it's just something to consider if you want to protect your personal information. If you're working on something very confidential and you don't want other people to know what it is, then don't store it on the work servers. Store it on something like Dropbox. And if for some reason you're in an environment where you don't have email access, you can encrypt those files. And you can do it with Microsoft Office. It's really easy. I can send links later, or you can literally Google, how do I encrypt a Word document? And you can do that to protect that particular file.
Great, that's so helpful. I think
those are hopefully some actionable things that people can do.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so handy. And I mean, when you say things like encrypt, I think people instantly go, oh my gosh, I can't encrypt. That sounds just way too cybersecurity. But like you said, it's been made so accessible for everyone now. It's a simple matter of just like Googling it, copying and pasting the code that has been given, or even sometimes just dropping it into something that does it for you. And then it's done and you can just download it. So I think having these like handy tips, even if it's just as small as separating your email addresses from the professional work one and your personal one, like all of those elements play a big factor into the security that and also the personal boundaries that we create for ourselves while our work and home life is merging. So thank you for that. That's really handy.
Yeah.
And then I guess
there is the other side of it to what. There is the other side of it to what the employers should be doing. Do you want me to go through that now or not?
Yeah, might as well. I think there are a lot of people who are in those management positions who are going, okay, what does this mean for my staff and everything else? So please let us know.
Sure. And these are questions that you can actually ask an employer what they're doing, or even in an interview situation, you could bring it up and find out what they're doing. So there's kind of three questions that you could ask. The first one is, do you support remote workers as a way to access systems securely, either from home or when you're traveling or whatever? And good answers would be if they say things like, yes, we have a secured VPN, or yes, we have a secured cloud. And I know not everyone's a security expert, but even just asking these questions puts the onus on them. The second question to ask would be, does your email software filter emails? So you want to be looking for things like phishing emails and so forth. And do they offer training for employees about phishing emails? Because remember, that's the number one way that ransomware gets in. And then the last question to ask is just generally, what security software do you use? And again, good answers to look for would be things like virus scanning, ransomware protection, and then again, a secure VPN. So you don't have to be an expert to ask these questions, but you know, it's always the knowledge is power, and when you know what they should be answering, it helps.
Exactly. And I think it also, as you said, it makes them aware that this is your expectation, and it changes that conversation to be a bit more of a two-way street, instead of it just being like you're in the unknown and essentially just giving away your data and your security without knowing how this information is being used, and ways you can protect yourself. So that's really important to consider. And I guess, like, back to the cloud conversation, I think it is interesting to consider if it's not in a physical place that you can see or that you can identify. And I think that's kind of the issue that a lot of people have with technology. Like, we don't know where it's going. What is your take on that whole element of the cloud world?
Well, the cloud is not necessarily less secure than on-site servers. In fact, 90% of break-ins, as I said, come from these phishing emails. And honestly, it doesn't matter where your data is stored. If a phishing email works and they get in, they're going to get your data, whether it's on a cloud or an on-site server. And in fact, most people are using a cloud and they just don't realize it. Like if you use Dropbox or Google Docs, or you have anything in Microsoft Azure, you're using the cloud. So again, my advice is to ask the questions to find out if your personal data is protected. So ask what, you know, the employer has in place, and passwords. Passwords are a huge thing that are often not used properly. So the best thing to do is to let your browser pick your password. You know how it comes up with that ridiculously long, obscure password? So let it pick that password and let your browser save that password. And that's the most secure that you can do. And then make sure the password on your laptop or your desktop that you change it regularly, or again, use an obscure password. Like, don't use your dog's name or your last name or anything 123. Like, it's just not secure.
But I guess if something remembers it and saves it, what if, like, the hacker then finds a spot that it remembers it? Like, I remember I went to this, like, tech event recently, and they described cloud to be this kind of like honeypot. So once you find where the cloud data has been stored, it's like you've found all of these other people's information. You've essentially tapped into this, like, honeypot of data that you can exploit for your own gains. Is that kind of like a misconception, or are there boundaries in place to kind of protect that? What's the deal?
There's absolutely boundaries in place. And again, that's why if I was going to store a huge amount of information, I would use one of those big providers, because they have the security teams in place that have secured them. Yeah, and with all the protections that you need.
That's good to know as well. And I guess this is particularly prevalent given the fact that, you know, most people are now either working remotely or transitioning into this new age where we're very much constantly interfacing digitally. So in regards to COVID-19, I would love to know what does this mean for personal security, and where do you think this is kind of heading as far as personal security goes into our day-to-day working world?
Yeah, well, I think we have proven that we can work remotely, at least for the most part, effectively, right? Maybe it's been a rocky couple weeks, but generally everyone is managing to work remotely. So I think we're going to see a shift in the workforce. Either, you know, some of us will continue to work remotely 100% of the time for economic reasons, or companies may adopt the hot seat type of office where you work remotely, you know, maybe 2/3 of the time, but 1/3 you come in for meetings and you have a hot desk, or you use a conference room or whatever it is. So obviously there's some security concerns with that. One is that we end up using personal machines at home. Like I use my personal laptop, for example. And then of course, companies have set up VPNs, virtual private networks, for all the folks working remote to access the servers. And some of them haven't been set up securely, or they have what I would call light security. So that needs to be fixed. And then, of course, there's been some security concerns with all this conferencing software, right, that we've recently heard about, Zoom and so forth. So I think one thing is be rest assured that Zoom and all the other conferencing companies are working on it, and they're going to find a fix. I mean, Zoom has already put in a new password thing, and there'll be other prevention methods that are put in by those companies. So leave it to those companies to figure that out. And then other companies obviously have to figure out how to secure their VPNs and make sure that if someone is using a personal machine, that there's security software on it.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, as an individual, what you can do is open up the dialogue with the security team, right? And find out, how can I be hurt, or how can I protect myself? And once you open up that dialogue, then I think you'll see action starting to happen.
That's good to know as well. And I think like a lot of people don't even know where to begin, like what questions to ask, because it's the whole you don't know what you don't know. So having these key pointers is a really good indication that it doesn't matter what technical skill level you're at, you can still be having this conversation. So that's a really good takeaway as well. And along with that, how does, I mean, there's been a lot about, you know, the GDP and cookies and personally identifiable information and what this all means for our privacy and our security moving forward. And I know Facebook's had a lot of difficulties with this in the past few years, thanks to, you know, the Cambridge Analytica scandal and everything else that's happening. So I feel like it all kind of ties in. What is your general take on privacy and protecting user data, and what these regulations may or may not mean for the individual and the workplace?
Right. Well, with the European regulations, the GDPR, what actually happened is they have almost set the global standard, and many countries or states have adopted similar regulations. So California and Washington, for example, in the Western world, have almost duplicated what GDPR is doing. And Japan is very similar in the East, and Canada, to a certain extent, has adopted some of it.
Mm-hmm.
But the biggest takeaway is that companies are responsible for data safety, and they have to ensure that it's secured. So they are responsible for securing your personal data. And they can also be fined if there's a data leak. And there has been some big fines issued. They also have to inform individuals if the data has been stolen. And again, many companies have had to own up to this and say information is out there. But the good news is that these regulations are making companies stand up and work proactively to secure their systems. So yes, it's a process, but it's starting to happen, and I think it's a good thing.
It seems like it's long overdue. I think this is kind of idea for especially the generation, like the digital native generation, who kind of teach the yes box before even reading it. It's this whole idea of like, how do we reclaim that element of privacy and safety when we've already given it away? So it helps to know that there are governing bodies that are trying to change this conversation moving forward, but also that we can be a bit more aware of our own data privacy and our like personal rights as well. So I guess along with that, this does kind of tie into the element of workplace culture. I think that especially those who are in toxic workplace culture environments, there can be elements of cyberbullying, and maybe there's this kind of like privacy breach that happens because of micromanagement and that extreme need to control. So when someone is leaving this toxic environment, how do they make sure that their information is truly left behind the workplace and kept with them? And how do you kind of make sure that you're cleared of that place and that your data and privacy your information isn't still being used by them behind the scenes?
Yeah. Well, the first thing you should do is delete all of your personal emails. And hopefully that's an easy job if you've kept them all in a separate folder. And of course, if you're reading them on a remote server, not a problem, because they were never on your local machine.
Yeah.
The other thing is, under a lot of these PII regulations, which we talked about, you can request that your personal data is erased. And you just have to make that request in writing, and they have 30 days to comply. So you certainly can do that too.
Mm-hmm. That's good to know. I think there's a lot of elements where people do put that request through, but then it's not always received. And then I guess it's up to the individual whether they want to take that to a legal standpoint or just call it a day. What are some ways that we can kind of encourage companies to be looking at this as a must as part of their like policies, rather than just saying, oh, they want their personal data, but we doubt they're going to follow through on it, like kind of calling their bluff on it?
Yeah, well, I think opening the conversation is the first thing.
Yeah.
Which is important, when you start asking questions about, how do I protect myself, or how are you protecting me? That starts the conversation. And with a lot of these regulations too, there is a governing body. So if they're not complying, there's usually, you can escalate it. And I understand in some circumstances, individuals are not emotionally ready to fight that battle.
Yeah.
But in other circumstances, it's warranted, and people have started to do that. So as time goes on, I think we'll find companies are complying much easier.
Yeah, that's good to know. And you're from Toronto. So I was recently reading that it's meant to be in the next 4 years, one of the rising kind of tech hubs of the world. So I guess that's a prime spot for you to be in, given everything that's currently occurring. I would love to know a bit more about the cultural perspective of being based in Canada, and what this means for embracing remote work and cybersecurity and just the whole tech space. Do you find that it's quite progressive, or are there certain cultural nuances that may be holding back elements that are important to be at the forefront of early on?
Well, we have been described as Silicon Valley North. I don't think in general the tech development in Canada is dynamic as it is in, say, Silicon Valley in California, but certainly Canada has some shining stars, and generally Canadians are a little more easygoing, a little more modest.
Yeah,
we're not good at tooting our own horns.
I think we have that in common, Australians.
But yes. But Canada's a great place for collaboration, and there's all kinds of tech support here, especially for startups that provide resources, and some of them provide funding, some of them provide expertise, some of them provide actual physical space, and there's a lot of collaboration that happens, and the government is very supportive of that. So I think because of that, we do see a lot of innovation out of Canada.
And I guess in some ways, you might be one of the countries leading the forefront of this remote work being the new norm, and everyone having this open conversation about technology and data privacy. And hopefully that can kind of set the tone moving forward as well. So it's good to keep that in mind. So along with that, yes, I think that this kind of cybersecurity world can seem quite abstract, which I touched on briefly. And it's almost like, yeah, we don't know what we don't know. And yes, we can read up on it and try and be more informed. And I think that's a great starting point. But along with that, it can also be comforting to know that there are people, as you said, like those larger companies who are kind of working really hard to make sure that things are operating and running smoothly, and protecting those that are within their interest. So along with that, I'd love to know a bit more about this whole idea of like white hacking, and who is out there kind of like guarding our security, and how that element works as well.
Sure. Yeah. There's a huge industry of what they would call penetration testing or white hacking. And I love this industry. It's actually full of like incredibly smart people who are hired to hack into systems to test the defenses of the company. So the pen testers would provide a full report of their findings and provide recommendations and solutions on how to improve the security. And I love it because it protects both the company and the employees ultimately. But I just think it's a neat thing. I actually know a couple of white hackers, and they're always kind of crazy people, right? Like they could have went to the dark side, but they're actually on the white side. And they have creative minds, because sometimes in order to find a way to hack in, you have to be creative and smart. So hackers are not stupid people, right? It's a business.
Makes sense.
Like the bad guys, it's a business and it's thriving, right? So you need equally smart and intelligent people on the good side trying to fight against that.
For sure. And it just occurred to me that being kind of black and white, it's nice to know that there are clear divides, but I imagine there would be some elements of gray. Is there such thing as like the gray elements, like the moral, when the morals get slightly compromised, or maybe, yeah, I don't know how that would occur in the tech world, but there must be some shades of gray in between that black and white kind of conversation.
I'm sure there is. I've never heard of any of the white hackers
Turning,
going to the dark side, but
okay.
You never know. I don't know.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, it just popped up. I was wondering. So in regards to that, I would love to know, actually, before I do, I always throw in a devil's advocate question just because it's nice to mix things up a bit. So yeah, in the tech space, there's this whole idea of like singularity and everything becoming, all the technology becoming unified. And I think also, I mean, you touched on Silicon Valley, but it's almost like elitist in the sense that you're only in the know if you understand the technology and if you can speak that language, and if you have the privilege to be able to access it and everything else. So it does seem like it's a very enclosed bubble that isn't really inclusive of the wider general public, and it's almost intentionally, you could argue that's almost intentionally built that way. And I think that's a very dangerous slope to be heading down, because not everyone will have the resources to be able to access this kind of knowledge and to be able to upskill and learn and everything else. So it is really interesting to think about the role of cybersecurity and how this relates to equality and everything else. So in saying that, I would love to know how you are, or how we can encourage cybersecurity to be more inclusive.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. And my answer is knowledge is power. So I would encourage everyone listening to take responsibility and educate yourself as best you can. There's some really simple steps that you can take that everyone can do. You do not need to be a security expert to do this. And I'll just outline them again. I've mentioned a personal email address, and use one of the reputable companies that have put a lot of money into security and their infrastructure. So that'd be Google, Microsoft, or Apple. And either read those emails on a remote browser or keep them in a separate folder on your desktop. The other one is the same with documents. If you have private documents, keep them on Dropbox or something similar, or in Google Docs, right? So it's separated from your company. And then the third thing is ask those questions to open the conversation with the security people in your organization. So put it on to those tech experts, like your tech admins, and ask them what they're doing to protect your data and to protect your company. So I think everyone can do that. And hopefully those are kind of 3 simple steps that everyone can take. Or if you're interviewing at a company, ask those questions.
Yeah. I think there's always an element of trust in that as well. Like even once you ask the questions, you're still sort of receiving the information with trust and with an open mind. So we have to hope that the ones who are in charge of that data, or who do have that more well-rounded knowledge of technology, are providing the correct information. So I guess that's also an interesting thing to consider as well, both keeping that conversation up, but then also maintaining enough sort of base level knowledge that you can kind of know what to look out for. So yeah, that's a really great tip to keep in mind. And then I guess I'd love to know where you see cybersecurity progressing as we head into this new norm. And like you mentioned that Canada's sort of quite progressive, and there's a lot of new developments happening. What is going on with the cybersecurity world from an internal perspective? Where can we see this technology evolving?
Well, I love that you say we don't know what we don't know. And I think to a certain extent that applies to security as well. We do know that ransomware is increasing and that cyber attacks are increasing in their intensity. So they're doing fewer attacks, but more focused and more in depth. So they're requesting higher ransoms and they're doing more damage. So we know that's happening. And I see it, artificial intelligence getting more involved. And the reason for that is because humans can only do so much, but you can set up an AI system that can track what is normal behavior on a network and can identify when things are not normal that humans can't detect. So ioFABRIC has some of that technology. We're actually leading the way with it, but I can see more and more developing as we go, more intelligence putting into it.
That's really interesting. I think a lot of avenues do point towards AI and the potential that that holds. So it makes sense that cybersecurity would go hand in hand with that. And I mean, you also mentioned Bitcoin a bit earlier on. I would love to know if your company has any specific involvements with that, or how you see that how you see that engaging with cybersecurity and that kind of relationship or partnerships that may occur as things progress.
Yeah. We don't have any relation with Bitcoin at all. I mean, a lot of people have invested in Bitcoin because the stock keeps going up, but Bitcoin is really the currency of criminals because you can't trace it. So I personally associate Bitcoin with kind of the bad guys, and I don't want anything to do with it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, and the other thing that you mentioned as well was that, in case someone has engaged with ransomware in some way, like maybe they've clicked the button, or maybe they accidentally opened something that they didn't realize was malicious. What is your advice to someone who has taken that next step and unfortunately may be experiencing some kind of breach without even realizing it?
I think the best thing to do is to contact your IT department and to notify them what's happened so they can start looking into it. But at that point, you should probably shut your system down and let an expert get involved before more damage happens, unfortunately.
And I guess from a personal level, if if they haven't taken your advice and had two separate folders and two separate computers and everything else in relation to work and home, and they've opened up a work-related, a seemingly work-related email on their personal computer, what would they then do? Because IT may not be liable for their personal items, so it kind of becomes up to them to resolve that issue.
Yeah, well, hopefully they have backups. In the worst case, the system is trashed, and hopefully they have a reliable backup, either on an external drive or somewhere else that's secured. But in most instances, ransomware isn't after someone's personal data. As in what you have on your home computer, they want a corporation.
Yeah.
Right? So generally, I would say your home systems are safe. It's just the data, the personal data that you have stored on your work servers.
Yeah, that makes sense. They've got bigger fish to fry.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we all have personal photos or whatever, but keep them in iCloud or somewhere that's not on the work servers.
Yeah. That's really good to keep in mind. So I guess in relation to everything that we've discussed today, I would love to know a bit more about what you do and your current developments, and also any kind of final takeaways that you'd like us to all keep in mind.
Sure. Well, for an actual takeaway, if anyone is interested in learning more about ransomware and how to protect corporate systems, I do have a free ebook that they can find on the ioFABRIC website, which is ioFABRIC.com, so ioFABRIC.com, and it's right there, and you can link to it as well.
Yeah.
So that's a takeaway. And I guess just those three things that I had suggested that people do with their email, their passwords, their documents, and ask the questions of your IT department.
And I guess that's the most we can do if we don't have our own learning. But maybe for those who are interested in learning a bit more or starting to explore this, do you have any kind of key sites or reputable companies that you can think of that might be a good starting point for someone who's going, I really want to upskill in this area of technology, especially as job competition becomes even more fierce and there's even more scarcity around long-term employment, I think more people are looking to find ways to stay ahead of the curve and maintain an element of relevancy in this changing world. Where would you suggest to kind of like begin that learning journey?
Well, our site, ioFABRIC.com, has quite a few resources, so that would be one place to start.
Great.
But another place would, to see what some of the big providers are doing, and not that they're the end all be all, but they have been in this market for a while, and they have a lot of information to share.
Yeah, that's good to know as well. And I guess from your perspective, did you go down the traditional academic route of learning, or have you kind of continuously evolved your skill set as times have changed as well? Oh, yeah, there. I don't think I've lost you. Oh no, it's like freeze.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we're back, everyone.
We're back. Okay. So I guess there's been a lot of learning over the last 20 years, but I have always been involved in tech. And one of my first jobs was with a firewall company. So that was back in the early 90s. And we were at the forefront of internet security then. And it's interesting how things have changed, because back then all you needed was a firewall and then you were safe. But as the years have gone on and cybersecurity has evolved and the hackers have evolved, you need a lot more than just a firewall. So I've been learning as you go.
I think that's kind of the way in all fields, but I imagine especially the case for technology. So that's good to keep in mind as well. Like, it's never too late to start learning and get involved and like fine tune those skills. So that's a nice touch as well. And so I guess, because you also mentioned that you're in the marketing side of the tech industry, and you're a woman in tech and one of the few. How do you find that the marketing elements kind of play into how technology is perceived, or how your software is perceived on the whole?
We try to provide information as much as we can to people out there. We don't want to withhold any grand secrets. So we're always in the education. The ebook that I've offered everyone is actually 4 steps that you need to take to prevent ransomware from stealing your data. So effectively, it's a guide how you can build your own system. Now, obviously, you would have to have some technical know-how to do that, but this is the kind of information we want to share, just to show everyone that you can beat the criminals, you can secure your data, you can make sure that you never lose data.
Yeah, that's really refreshing to know that it can be within our hands as well, and we don't have to rely on outside sources. So that's handy to consider. And I guess the other thing you touched on as well was the element of trusting in the larger companies with your data. What happens if one of these great companies ends up having some kind of security breach, or you feel like they have misused your data in some way, other than kind of like filing a legal suit? Is there anything else that we could be considering? Again, the Facebook dilemma came to mind, but I think that this, as most companies are doing their best to make sure this doesn't happen. I mean, obviously it works in their best interest as well, but mistakes do happen. So what is your kind of take on this side of things?
Mistakes do happen for sure, and because criminals are constantly looking for new ways to exploit, I think you have to be careful what you put online, like in Facebook or whatever. I think you have to be careful what you would store on a work server, and keep anything that's sensitive on your own personal machine as much as possible.
Yeah, and just really minimize the risks associated with that in all forms.
Yeah.
That's good to know. Well, we've got 5 more minutes before the questions pop up. So if anyone has questions, you can start adding them into the Q&A now, and we'll start curating them. In the meantime, I would love to know, Deborah, what's next for you? Like, what's sort of coming up on the agenda? I mean, obviously everything's sort of, actually probably not in cybersecurity, but for the rest of the world, a lot of this has been put on hold. So I'd love to know what you're predicting for the rest of 2020.
Well, we've actually been busier than normal because with everybody working from home and the pandemic and so forth, we're actually right now offering our software for free to healthcare organizations, and specifically organizations that are feeling vulnerable because of the whole COVID thing. So we're quite busy right now working with a few organizations trying to get their systems secured. So I think that's probably for the foreseeable future, the next few months. And then beyond that, we're working with multiple partners just to get our software out there and get the word out there that the approach we take to protecting data is really the way of the future. It's the way everyone should be protecting their data to ensure that you never lose it.
And that approach more specifically is backing up your data. Is that what you're saying?
It's more than that. So we use artificial intelligence to prevent attacks and to prevent data loss. We send alerts. We do have a snapshot that we take that does secure your data, and then we have a patented way to ensure that it can't be encrypted and it can't be stolen. So it's a multi-pronged approach. So we protect and prevent.
And I feel like that's often the better way to go, because being on that reactive end of things where you're just dealing with the aftermath is very messy, very costly, and not really the most efficient way of addressing conflicts that may arise. So it's good to know that you are more on the preventative side of things as well.
There's a lot of products out there that will notify you when you have had a breach or when your data has been destroyed. But the truth is, by that point, it's too late, right? So we're all about the prevention.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. And toxic workplace culture also comes to mind. There are so many levels to be tackling the issue. So again, it really does come down to preventing it before it escalates to that worst case scenario. So I think that's kind of across the board. Try and mitigate the problem before it escalates. Really good to know. So we've got a couple more minutes. I'll just see if there's any questions yet. Still working on it. Well, I've got a couple questions. I would love to know, for those who maybe are in their midpoint of their career and they're looking to not necessarily career transition, but they might be leaving a toxic workplace or a particular work environment and looking to transition into either a similar field or a similar but slightly different area, and maybe it's technology related. What is your sort of advice to someone, especially for women who are considering entering into this technology space, or considering migrating some of the skills they have over into a slightly more tech-based role?
Definitely go for it. There's lots of place for women, for sure. And I think since generally women are a minority in tech, you tend to stand out a bit. And I think that can be used to your advantage. It's a good thing, right? It's exciting. I love working with intelligent people, and generally in tech, you're working with smart people. So every day is a new day and it's always exciting. So I would definitely encourage someone who's thinking tech to branch out, and there's lots of roles, right? You don't have to be a programmer. I'm actually marketing and sales. So as long as you enjoy learning new things, it's a great career.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the misconceptions about working in tech. People think that means, you're, as you said, more on the programming side, and it's just this one-dimensional kind of world that's only available to that element. But it also, as long as you're actually in that company as a woman, you are a woman in tech, irrelevant of whether you're doing the actual technical elements behind it. So it's good that you've reminded us about that as well. So I'll just check in with the questions. Let's have a look. Yes, we do have a couple of questions, which I'll get to now. One of them is, there's been tension in tech for the past decade or so between convenience and security. Yes, the big tech companies are convenient, but their free use comes at the cost of being surveilled by their advertisers. The normalization of clicking the accept button is a huge issue. What are your thoughts on convenience versus privacy? And perhaps should we be looking at smaller email services like Proton Mail instead? Very loaded. Thank you.
Yes, I hear that there's an argument there. The reason why I was recommending one of the large email providers for your personal email is because I know that unfortunately the little companies can't compare with their massive security teams. Like they have full-time dedicated security staff, and a little email provider won't have that. Now, I'm not saying don't use a little company for your internet service or for other things that you do, but to actually host your email, because there is so much confidential information in there, that's my recommendation. And yes, I hear you about the advertisers and so forth. I hear you about that, but I think looking at the whole picture, the risk is less. If that's what you're concerned about, is your personal data, the risk is less with one of the big providers.
That's interesting as well. And I guess the risk is less if you trust in them and like believe it in the service that they're offering, and if overall they have been able to prove that they deliver that like premium service and back up their privacy policies. So yeah, it's definitely good to keep in mind. Yeah. Thank you for the question. That's good. And yeah, I think that's most of it. Do you have any other elements that you'd like to add in relation to maybe people who are on the fence about considering their like maybe they're just starting to separate their two accounts and they're going, this is too much work, or they have a bit of barrier against it, or maybe in similar instances they don't want to switch over their email server to a larger group. What is your kind of
well, if you trust your provider, that's great. Like that don't make your life more complicated by switching over. But definitely I would keep your personal emails in a separate folder. So at least do that. And if you have 5,000 emails in your inbox, as some of us do, just start today. Like from today moving forward, you can go back and deal with that at another time. Just start today. Take it in little chunks and just make one move to help protect your privacy.
Mm-hmm. No, that's really good to know, because that way it doesn't seem as overwhelming, and I think that it's something that we can all apply to our day-to-day lives as well.
And tell your mom to stop emailing you on your work email. Like I tell my mom that too. Like, use my iCloud email.
Also, those chain messages.
Just to separate it, right?
Just in regards to telling our parents, those I think we all know them, those chain messages. They used to be really popular on email, where someone would send like, if you send this message, you're more likely to be loved or receive X amount of money, like abundance in the world. Those kind of chain emails that kind of died when Hotmail wasn't a thing anymore. But I feel like they've migrated to Facebook, so now I'm seeing them all the time on and it is generally more of a mature demographic that follow along these things. But I think those are just like hotspots for security breaches, because it's
absolutely, because they'll even have things like answer this quiz, and they'll ask you like, what's your dog's name? What city were you born in? What's your favorite place to travel? Like, people are giving away passwords effectively, right? How many kids do you have? Like, they have all kinds of information from you from answering simple surveys. So be careful when you answer those. I'm not super paranoid, but I think twice before I answer things like that, especially dog name. That's actually one of the biggest passwords that people use, is their dog's name. How many people have Cooper as their email, or Rover?
Yeah, that's really good to consider as well. It's a handy like insider tip. For those of us who have our passwords currently set as one of our pet names, don't do it. That's so good to know. And let's see, still got a few minutes left. I guess are there any other kind of like, if you could give advice to someone, like, is there anything that you wish you would have known earlier, or that you often have people come to you and say, thank you so much for telling me this. I wish I'd had this information like 6 months ago. What is that kind of like key piece that you might be able to share for those of us who are trying to be on the preventative side rather than reactive?
Mm. Well, I guess the biggest thing for me is the passwords. But if I can kind of answer the question, just like with career in general, I find women in general have a lot of imposter syndrome, and it's rampant in tech. So the other women that I know that are in tech feel that they don't equal the men in the room, and it's crazy.
Yeah.
It's absolutely crazy. And, I think it's important to know that everybody has insecurities, and to understand that you are good enough, you are smart enough to be in tech. You do belong at the table. And that's the attitude that I try and take forward.
That's such a positive note to end it on. And I think like this whole idea of imposter syndrome is still on the table, and it still pops up a lot in conversation. I think we're all aware of it now, and we are trying to make room on that table for ourselves. So it's really nice to hear from someone who has done that and achieved that, and to know that it very much is possible. We've just got to be starting that conversation, and to essentially know our worth and believe in that, irrelevant of maybe the messages that are being sent. Actually, there's a group called Women in Tech, which is it was a non-for-profit that started 2 years ago. This isn't sponsored or anything. I know her well, and she's lovely. And they basically set up this. They go all over the world setting up these like ambassadors, and the idea is you can't become what you don't see. And so this is something I consider a lot, coming from a media background. But without that kind of representation, it's really hard to know that you could even belong in that role. So it is so great to be seeing women in tech and sharing their message, and sharing their stories about how they got there, and what their journey has been like, and some key things to look out for, because that could be the difference between people choosing different career paths. And in Australia at the moment, they're actually investing a huge amount of money into STEM. We're on the fence about whether there's been a return on investment, but it's been a massive area, especially in Victoria, but probably across the board, that we've been trying to evolve in. So thank you for sharing your side of things. I think we do have one more question, which we've got time for. Let me see. I don't know if this has any meaning to you, but it says, consider correct horse battery staple as a password generator.
Say it again, consider.
So the message says, consider correct horse battery staple as a password generator. I guess when considering passwords, should we be looking at kind of scrambling random words? How can we be creating secure passwords, other than what you said about the ones that are automatically created for us? Are there any other kind of password creating tips that you have?
Well, obviously you want to use something random, right? You don't want to use a real word. So that's why I simply use the massively long passwords that are suggested for me, and I have my browser save them. But there are other software programs out there that you can use, like password keepers. I mean, whatever you do not want to just have a list on your desktop called passwords with 50 different logins and what your password is, including your bank.
Actually, that reminds me about something that I'm currently dealing with as well. We've got one more minute left. For those of us who are working with remote teams and we need to share our passwords across, what are some ways that we can encrypt the passwords and send that over to the people who might need to access it? Do you have any tips on that? I guess this applies more for like small teams rather than the big companies, but it's something that I've been really considering a lot lately as well.
Yeah, well, you can encrypt emails, right? So if you need to send it in an email, you can encrypt the email and have them decrypted on the other side. You could do that. Or if it's a simple password, which really shouldn't be, but if it is, pick up the phone, like, and actually verbally tell someone what it is.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people don't like using the phone these days, but it does still work.
Yeah, I actually prefer it now because it's better than the internet half the time at the moment. So, but
Yeah.
it's all a work in progress. So with that said, thank you so much for having a chat with us today, Deborah. Where can we find you if we want to know more information, if we want to reach out to you personally? What's your, where you hang out in the digital space?
Well, probably the best thing to do is to send me an email. So it's Deborah at ioFABRIC.com. You can link that up if you'd like.
Yeah.
But certainly you can go to our website, ioFABRIC.com, and if you fill out any of the forms on there, they actually go to me, so I'll get them.
Great, amazing. And I'm just going to link the download here for anyone who might want to access it. But it'll also be available underneath Deborah's speaker page. So if you're watching this replay, you still have access. So yeah. Thank you so much for everything, Deborah. I think this has been very insightful. You've covered both the key basics and then also some really great insights into cybersecurity on the whole. And I think we've all learned a lot from today. So I really appreciate you taking the time to share all this with us.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. Have a good day.
You too. Thanks, everyone. See you at the next panel event.